The first thing Admiral Rebecca Stone noticed wasn't the screaming alarm or the flashing red lights that suddenly bathed the bridge of the USS Liberty in crimson hell. It wasn't even the way her hot coffee suddenly tasted like ash in her mouth. No, what hit her first was the sound and noise that bypassed her ears and went straight to that primal part of her brain that still remembered when humans huddled around fires. Afraid of what lurked in the dark, it was the sound of pure, undiluted terror. The distress signal tore through 17 star systems simultaneously, carried on frequencies that shouldn't have been possible to broadcast. The alien harmonics were so raw, so desperate, that even the ship's translation computers seemed to hesitate before processing the words. When they finally came through, they hit the bridge crew like a physical blow. "This is High Commander Calix. Of the Centaurian Republic," the voice crackled through the speakers. And Becca could hear something she'd never heard before in a Centaurian transmission fear. Real, bone-deep, existential terror. "The Void Devourers have consumed our outer worlds. Our defensive fleets, ... they're gone. Everything's gone. Our children, our cities, our entire civilization is being eaten alive." Lieutenant Noah Martinez, barely 25 and still wet behind the ears from the academy, looked up from his communications console with wide eyes. The kid had joined up thinking he'd spend his tour cataloging distant nebulae and making first contact with friendly alien traders. Instead, he was about to get a front-row seat to the kind of cosmic horror that turned seasoned space marines into gibbering wrecks. Admiral Noah's voice cracked slightly, the signals getting stronger. They're broadcasting on every frequency imaginable. Even the emergency channels reserved for planetary extinction events. Becca set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, the kind of precise movement that came from decades of military training. Her weathered hands scarred from the Proxima Centauri campaign and marked with the chemical burn she'd earned during the Asteroid Belt Rebellion didn't shake. They never shook. Not anymore. But inside, ice water was flooding her veins. The Centaurians weren't just another alien species. They were the apex predators of known space, beings whose technology was so advanced it might as well have been magic. Their ships could fold space-time like origami, slip between dimensions, and unleash energy weapons that could crack planets in half. They'd been the galactic community's enforcers for over 3,000 years, the ones everyone called when something truly nasty needed to be put down hard and permanently. If the Centaurians were begging for help, then something was very, very wrong with the universe. "Continue the transmission," Becca ordered. Though every instinct screamed at her to cut the channel and pretend they'd never heard it, Calix's voice came through again. Weaker now, more desperate. "We're broadcasting to anyone who can hear this. The Void Devourers are not like anything we've encountered before. They don't conquer, they consume. They don't destroy matter, they unmake it. Where our worlds once stood, there is now ... nothing. Not empty space, not debris, nothing. The very concept of existence has been ... eaten." There was a pause, filled with static that sounded suspiciously like screaming. "We know what most of you think of us. We know you fear our power, resent our authority. But I'm begging you, please, if there's any mercy left in this galaxy, help us. Help us before they finish consuming everything we are and turn their hunger toward your worlds." The transmission cut off, leaving the bridge in absolute silence. "You know what's funny about moments like these? The universe has this twisted sense of humor. Here they were, receiving a desperate plea for help from the most powerful military force in known space. And all Becca could think about was the irony. For decades, the Centaurians had looked down on humanity with barely concealed disgust. They'd called Earth a death world, not because it was dead, but because everything on it was constantly trying to kill everything else. Humans were barbarians, savages who'd somehow stumbled into space travel despite spending their entire evolutionary history perfecting new and creative ways to murder each other. The galactic community had standards, after all. Clean wars fought with energy weapons that vaporized enemies instantly. Conflicts resolved through orbital bombardment that left no suffering, no lingering agony. Civilized destruction, if such a thing existed. Humanity. Humanity fought dirty. They used chemical weapons, biological warfare, nuclear fire, and tactics that would make a professional torturer lose sleep. They were the species that had weaponized diseases, turned their own atmosphere into poison gas during world wars, and somehow managed to split atoms before they'd figured out how to get along with their neighbors. The Centaurians had kept humanity contained in their little corner of space like a dangerous pet that might bite if handled incorrectly. But now those same barbaric humans were suddenly looking a lot more useful. Lieutenant Martinez's console erupted in activity, streams of data cascading across multiple screens. Admiral, we're receiving secondary reports from the outer colonies. Long-range sensors are picking up massive fleet movements from Terra, Luna Base, and the Mars shipyards. It's like someone kicked a hornet's nest. Becca's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was too sharp, too predatory for that. The Deathworlders are mobilizing, she said, tasting the words. For the first time in her career, that designation didn't feel like an insult. It felt like a promise. Ma'am, Noah continued, his fingers flying over his controls. President Williams is requesting immediate secure channel communication. Priority Alpha clearance. The fear that had been coursing through Becca's system suddenly transformed into something else entirely. Something hot and fierce and utterly human, a righteous fury, mixed with the kind of protective instinct that had once driven her ancestors to fight. Saber-toothed tigers with sharpened sticks. Because here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy had never quite understood. They were absolutely terrified of almost everything in the universe. Every shadow could hide a predator. Every stranger might be an enemy. Every peaceful moment was just the calm before the next storm. But when something threatened the things they cared about, when some cosmic horror decided to start eating civilizations like popcorn, that fear didn't make them curl up and hide it, made them furious. Open the channel to President Williams, Becca ordered, standing up from her command chair. Her reflection in the darkened viewport showed a woman who'd spent 40 years learning how to kill things efficiently. And every line on her face told a story of violence, survived and enemies defeated. And Noah, she added, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding respect in a galaxy that wanted humanity to sit down and shut up. Yes, ma'am? Send a message to Fleet Command. Tell them the galaxy's worst nightmare just met Earth's. She paused, letting the words sink in. I have a feeling the Void Devourers are about to learn why evolution spent millions of years trying to kill us off. The boy's eyes lit up with something between terror and excitement.
Admiral.
What should I tell them about our response, Admiral? Becca's grin widened, showing teeth. Tell them we're going hunting. Captain Oliver Ali. Hayes had seen a lot of impossible things in his 20-year career with Earth's deep space fleet. He'd watched stars being born in the spiral arms of distant galaxies. He'd witnessed alien civilizations that built cities, inside black holes and creatures that swam through the vacuum of space like it was warm ocean water. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the sight that greeted him through the main viewport of the heavy cruiser Vengeance. 43 human warships hung in the void at the edge of Terran space, and they looked like they'd been assembled by a madman with access to a military junkyard. There was the USS Retribution, a massive dreadnought whose hull was so covered in weapon ports it looked like a floating porcupine made of death. Light cruiser Hellhound had been retrofitted with mining lasers that could cut through asteroid cores because sometimes you needed to think outside the box when it came to creative destruction. Even the cargo hauler Lucky Strike had been pressed into service, its holds packed with enough high explosives to crack a moon in half. But here's what made Ali's chest swell with something between pride and terror. Every single one of these ships was crewed by volunteers, not conscripts, not soldiers ordered into battle by distant bureaucrats. Volunteers who'd heard that cry for help from across the galaxy and said, "Yeah, we'll take that fight." Sir Lieutenant Emma Rodriguez called from her station, her fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed fleet positions updating in real time. Emma was tough as nails had to be. Growing up in the asteroid mining colonies, where a moment's inattention could mean explosive decompression and a very short, very unpleasant death, We're receiving final ship confirmations. The Blackwater just completed their weapon loadout, and Captain Martinez reports his crew is ready for immediate deployment. Ali nodded, but his attention was caught by something else entirely. Through the bridge's massive transpersteel windows, he could see tiny figures moving around the hull of the destroyer Fury. Maintenance crews were spray painting something. On the ship's sides, in letters 10 feet tall, want to know what they were writing? Void this. You had to love human humor. Even especially when they were about to sail into the kind of cosmic horror that turned grown aliens into blubbering wrecks. It was the same gallows humor that had gotten humanity through world wars, plagues, and the kind of natural disasters that would have broken lesser species. When the universe showed its teeth, humans responded by baring their own and making jokes about it, but the laughter died in Ollie's throat when his communications array suddenly flared to life with an incoming transmission that made every screen on the bridge pulse with urgent red warnings. Sir, Emma's voice had gone tight with something that might have been fear, or excitement, or both. We're receiving a direct transmission from the Centaurian homeworld. Priority Alpha clearance. It's High Commander Kylix himself. Bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of life support systems and the distant thrum of the ship's massive fusion reactors. Every human on board knew that name. Kylix wasn't just any Centaurian, he was their supreme military commander, a being who'd never lost a battle in 3 centuries of warfare. The alien equivalent of Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Patton, all rolled into one impossibly elegant package. And now he was calling them. Put him through, Ali ordered, straightening his uniform jacket out of habit. Not that it mattered, Centaurians probably couldn't tell the difference between human military dress and a bag of dirty laundry, but some things were about respect. Respect was something you showed even to former enemies who were begging for help. The hologram that materialized in the center of the bridge was a masterpiece of alien evolution. Kylix stood nearly 8 feet tall, his silver skin seeming to glow with its own internal light. 4 arms moved with the kind of fluid grace that came from millions of years of genetic refinement, and his face held the sharp, angular beauty that had made Centaurians the subject of human art and poetry for decades. But something was wrong, terribly, catastrophically wrong. Those famous Centaurian eyes, usually as cold and calculating as polished gems, now held the hollow, desperate look of someone who'd watched entire worlds die screaming. His usually perfect posture was slumped with exhaustion, and there were what looked like stress cracks running along his silver skin like fault lines in a breaking planet. Humans, Kylix began, and his voice carried harmonics that the ship's translation systems couldn't quite process. The alien words seemed to crack and break as they emerged from the speakers, like someone trying to speak while drowning. We know what you are. Deathworlders, killers, barbarians, who turned your own planet into a crucible of violence and somehow emerged stronger for it. There was a pause, and Ollie could swear he heard something that sounded like sobbing in the background of the transmission. We've always feared your violence, your savage methods, your complete disregard for the civilized rules of warfare. Your species weaponizes diseases. You turn peaceful atoms into city-destroying fire. You've created chemical compounds whose only purpose is to cause maximum suffering before death. Kylix's 4 hands clenched into fists. We called you monsters and tried to keep you contained in your little corner of space because we were terrified of what you might do if you ever turned that creativity toward conquest. Here's where it gets interesting. Instead of being offended, every human on that bridge felt a strange surge of pride. Because Kylix wasn't wrong. Humanity had spent its entire evolutionary history surrounded by things that wanted to eat poison, crush, freeze, burn, or otherwise murder them. They'd responded by becoming very, very good at returning the favor. Other species developed art, philosophy, and elegant mathematics. Humans developed better ways to kill things and then wrote poetry about it afterward. But now, ... Alex's voice cracked like breaking glass, and the hologram flickered as if the transmission itself was struggling to maintain coherence. Now we're on our knees, begging you. The void devourers consume everything matter, energy, even the fundamental forces that hold reality together. They've taken 4 of our core worlds. Billions of Centaurians simply ceased to exist. Not killed, not destroyed, unmade, erased from the universe as if they never were. The alien commander's legs seemed to give out, and he dropped to what passed for knees in Centaurian anatomy. We have maybe days before they finish consuming our remaining worlds and turn their hunger toward the rest of the galaxy. Our weapons are useless. Our strategies are meaningless. Our 3,000-year military tradition means nothing against creatures that eat the concept of existence itself. That's when Admiral Rebecca Stone stepped into the hologram's field of view, and Ollie had to admire the timing. The old woman had a flair for dramatic entrances that would have made a theater. Director weep with joy. Stone's weathered face was set in an expression that Ollie had seen before, usually right before someone was about to have a very bad day. Her jaw was locked tight enough to crack teeth, and her eyes held the kind of cold fury that came from decades of watching good people die for stupid reasons. "Commander Calyx," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from surviving 40 years in a profession where mistakes got measured in body counts. "You're about to learn something that we've been trying to teach the galaxy for centuries." She stepped closer to the hologram projector, and even though Calyx was just a light construct, he seemed to shrink back from her presence. "Earth doesn't breed monsters because we're evil," Stone continued, her words cutting through the bridges. Silence like laser fire. "We breed monsters because sometimes, when the universe sends something that can't be reasoned with, can't be negotiated with, can't be civilized into submission, you need someone who understands that survival isn't about being nice." The Admiral's lips curved into what might charitably be called a smile, but Ollie had seen sharks with more warmth in their expressions. "You're about to discover why evolution spent millions of years trying to kill us off, Commander, and why sometimes the galaxy's worst nightmare is exactly what it needs to survive." Around them, 43 human warships hung in the void like sleeping predators, their crews preparing for a type of warfare that would make devils weep and angels look away in horror. But that's a story for what comes next. 6 days through hyperspace should have been routine. Just another milk run through the void lanes that connected the civilized galaxy. The kind of journey that seasoned spacers used to catch up on sleep, maintenance reports, and the latest episodes of whatever mindless entertainment was streaming from Earth. But there was nothing routine about the atmosphere aboard the 43 ships of humanity's hastily assembled fleet. As they raced toward Centaurian space, every crew member knew they were flying straight into the kind of cosmic horror that turned hardened space marines into gibbering wrecks, the kind of enemy that didn't just kill you, it erased you from existence so completely that the universe forgot you'd ever been born. Dr. Charlotte Wilson hadn't slept in 72 hours, and it showed. Her usually immaculate lab coat was stained with coffee and whatever passed for food in the cramped quarters of the science vessel Darwin. Her graying hair, normally pulled back in a professional bun, hung loose around a face that had aged. A decade in less than a week. But her eyes burned with the kind of manic intensity that came from staring into an abyss. So deep that the abyss started staring back. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, addressing the fleet's senior command staff via holographic conference, "I'm about to brief you on an enemy that shouldn't exist according to every law of physics we understand. An enemy that makes our worst nightmares look like children's bedtime stories." The holographic projections of 43 ship captains, Marine commanders, and tactical officers leaned forward in their chairs. These were people who'd fought pirates in the asteroid belts, survived boarding actions against hostile aliens, and stared down the barrel of weapons that could crack planets. But something in Dr. Wilson's voice made them all pay attention with the kind of focus usually reserved for last rites. "The void devours," she continued, her hands trembling as she manipulated the holographic displays, "aren't just destroyers in the conventional sense. They're not like the Krenethy swarm that strips planets of biological matter, or the Silicon Collective that converts worlds into raw materials for their hive ships. No, these things are far worse." The display shifted to show what had once been the Centaurian colony world of Nexus Prime. At least it showed where Nexus Prime used to be. Where a thriving planet had once orbited its star, there was now ... nothing. not empty space filled with debris, not an asteroid field where a world had been broken apart, just nothing, a void so complete that it hurt to look at directly. They consume the fundamental forces that hold matter together, Dr. Wilson explained, her voice getting quieter as if speaking too loudly might attract the attention of the things she was describing. Atomic bonds, quantum foam, the electromagnetic fields that keep electrons in orbit around nuclei. They don't destroy matter, they unmake it. They consume the very concept of existence itself. Colonel James Tank Thompson, commander of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, was a mountain of a man who'd earned his nickname by personally ramming through a fortified bunker door during the Proxima Centauri rebellion. His voice could shatter glass when he was angry, which was most of the time, and his idea of subtle tactics involved slightly smaller explosions. But now he spoke in barely more than a whisper. "Doc," he said, his scarred hands clenched into fists, "how exactly do we kill something that eats reality for breakfast? Want to know what's really terrifying?" Dr. Wilson's laugh. It was the kind of sound that came from someone who'd spent 6 days studying data that proved the universe was far more hostile than anyone had imagined, and who'd slowly been driven to the edge of sanity by what she'd discovered. The Centaurians tried everything, Colonel, everything. They threw antimatter bombs at these things, weapons that could reduce entire continents to subatomic particles. The Devourers absorbed the explosions and grew stronger. They used dimensional weapons that could fold space-time into impossible geometries. The creatures adapted and learned to manipulate dimensions themselves. She pulled up another display, this one showing the tactical readouts from the final Centaurian fleet engagement. Ships that could slice through the fabric of reality itself, reduced to expanding clouds of nothing in seconds. They even tried black hole generators, Dr. Wilson continued, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. Weapons that could create artificial singularities capable of devouring star systems. The Void Devourers didn't just survive. They consumed the black holes and used the gravitational energy to reproduce faster. The holographic conference fell silent except for the background hum of life support systems and the distant throb of fusion reactors. 43 of humanity's best military minds tried to process the implications of what they'd just heard. How do you fight an enemy that gets stronger every time you hurt it? How do you kill something that treats the laws of physics like suggestions? That's when Admiral Rebecca Stone leaned forward in her chair, and every person in the conference could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She'd spent 4 decades learning how to kill things efficiently, and her mind was already working through possibilities that would have horrified any civilized species. "Doctor," she said slowly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding respect in a galaxy that wanted humanity to sit down and shut up, "you said they adapted to Centaurian weapons. Energy weapons. Clean weapons designed by a species that spent millions of years perfecting elegant solutions to complex problems." Dr. Wilson nodded, not sure where the Admiral was going with this, "but they've never faced human weapons," Stone continued, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile, which was too sharp, too predatory for that. "They've never faced weapons designed by a species that spent its entire evolutionary history surrounded by things that wanted to kill it. Weapons created by beings who turned their own atmosphere into poison gas during global wars and somehow made nuclear fire before they figured out how to get along with their neighbors." The Admiral stood up, her weathered face hardening into an expression that had made enemy commanders surrender rather than face what came next. "These things have adapted to elegant solutions, refined tactics, and civilized warfare. But they've never encountered something truly dirty. They've never faced weapons designed by a species that weaponized diseases, turned peaceful chemistry into tools of mass destruction, and created compounds whose only purpose was to cause maximum suffering before death." Around the conference, 43 ship captains began to understand what their admiral was suggesting, and the mixture of horror and excitement on their faces was something that would have given alien psychologists nightmares for years. But understanding the theory was one thing. Seeing the reality was something else entirely. When the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Centaurian system 3 days later, Even the hardest veterans, people who'd seen their share of cosmic horror, fell completely silent. Where 6 thriving worlds had once orbited their star in perfect harmony, only 2 remained. And those 2 weren't intact. They were half consumed. Great wounds torn in reality itself, where the void devourers had fed. Chunks of planetary matter simply ceased to exist, leaving behind voids so complete that they hurt to look at directly. It was like someone had taken bites out of the universe itself, leaving holes where existence used to be. Jesus Christ, someone whispered over the fleet communication channel, their voice barely audible above the background. Static. Admiral. Stone's response cut through the shocked silence like a laser through flesh. "He's not here," she said grimly, her eyes fixed on the tactical displays that showed something moving in the void between the dying worlds. Something vast and hungry and utterly alien, just us devils. And in the darkness between the stars, something noticed their arrival and began to turn its attention toward these new morsels that had so thoughtfully delivered themselves for consumption. The real battle was about to begin. The first thing that hit Captain Tyler Brooks, when the Void Devourers came into sensor range, wasn't fear, it was nausea. His ship's instruments were screaming warnings that shouldn't have been possible, displaying readings that violated every law of physics he'd learned during 20 years of deep space mining. The entities moving toward them weren't just alien. They were wrong on a fundamental level that made his brain want to shut down rather than process what he was seeing. Picture trying to look at a 4-dimensional object with 3-dimensional eyes. Then multiply that discomfort by 1,000 and add the distinct feeling that reality itself was starting to come apart at the seams. That's what staring at a void devourer was like. They moved through space like living cancer, writhing masses of impossible geometry that seemed to exist in several dimensions at once. Where they passed, space itself became ... less. Not empty would have been a relief. These things consumed the very concept of existence, leaving behind voids so complete that they hurt to perceive directly. The largest of the creatures was the size of a small moon, its surface covered in what looked like mouths, but couldn't be. Mouths because mouths implied biology, and these things were something else entirely. Something that had evolved beyond the need for matter, energy, or any of the fundamental forces that held the universe together. All ships. Admiral Stone's voice crackled through the fleet communication channel, steady as bedrock, despite the cosmic horror bearing down on them. Weapons free. Engage at will. Remember, we're not trying to be heroes here. We're trying to be the galaxy's worst nightmare. That's when the human fleet did something that would have horrified every civilized species in known space. Instead of forming elegant battle lines or executing carefully choreographed tactical maneuvers, they scattered like a pack of rabid wolves and started doing things that violated every rule of proper warfare. Captain Tyler Brooks, commanding the mining vessel Hell's Digger, had spent his entire career hauling radioactive ore and industrial waste through the most dangerous shipping lanes in human space. His ship wasn't built for combat, it was built to survive anything the universe could throw at it, while carrying cargo that could kill everyone aboard. If the containment systems failed, which gave him an idea that would have made his insurance company cancel his policy on the spot. All hands abandoned ship. He bellowed into the ship's intercom as he aimed the Hell's Digger straight at the largest devourer. Emergency evacuation pods. Now, we're going out with style. His crew didn't question the order. When you'd spent years working the asteroid belts, you learned to trust your captain's judgment, even when that judgment seemed completely insane. Within minutes, escape pods were jettisoning from the mining vessel like seeds from a dying flower, their occupants strapping in for the ride of their lives. Brooks stayed at the helm, his hands steady on the controls as his ship accelerated toward something that could unmake matter with a thought. His cargo hold was packed with enough radioactive waste to turn a continent into a glowing crater, plus industrial toxins so nasty that they were banned on every civilized world in the galaxy. "You want to consume reality?" he growled into his unit, his ship's hull beginning to glow from the radiation leaking out of the compromised containment systems. "Try digesting this." The Hellsdigger slammed into the Void Devourer at a significant fraction of light speed, and for a moment, space itself seemed to hiccup. The creature's impossible geometry tried to absorb the impact, to consume the ship and add its mass to its own bulk. But human engineering had created toxins so vile, so fundamentally hostile to life, that even something that existed beyond conventional biology couldn't process them. The Devourer made a sound, if you could call it a sound, that seemed to come from several dimensions at once. It was the noise of reality itself screaming in pain. But Brooks was just the opening act. Captain Sofia Martinez had been commanding the destroyer Fury for 8 years. And in that time, she'd earned a reputation for two things: absolutely refusing to back down from a fight and having a vocabulary that could make hardened space marines blush. When she saw the Void Devourers bearing down on her fleet, her response was immediate and characteristically direct. All weapons, full spread. She screamed over the sound of klaxons and emergency alerts. Everything we've got. Nuclear warheads, antimatter torpedoes, kinetic impactors. I want every piece of ordnance on this ship fired at those things right now. Her tactical officer, a young lieutenant who joined the crew straight from the academy, looked up with wide eyes. Ma'am, our nuclear arsenal alone could sterilize a continent. If we fire everything at once, then we better make sure we're pointed at the right target. Martinez cut him off, tears of rage and terror streaming down her face as she watched the cosmic horrors advance on her fleet. Fire, fire, everything! The Fury unleashed its entire arsenal in a display of firepower that would have impressed even the Centaurians. Nuclear warheads designed to crack asteroids, antimatter torpedoes that could punch through planetary shields, kinetic impactors moving at relativistic speeds, all of it aimed at creatures that had already proven they could absorb conventional weapons and grow stronger. And you know what? For a moment, it actually worked. The lead Devourer staggered under the barrage, its impossible geometry flickering like a bad hologram. But then it began to adapt, to evolve, to incorporate the energy of the weapons into its own structure. That's when Captain Liam O'Connor made his move. O'Connor commanded a retrofitted cargo hauler called the Last Stand, not exactly the kind of ship you'd expect to be the deciding factor in a battle for the fate of the galaxy. But O'Connor had spent his career hauling very special cargo for very dangerous clients, the kind of shipments that didn't appear on any official manifest and were paid for in untraceable credits. His current cargo hold was packed with something that the Void Devourers had never encountered in their eons of consuming civilizations: Earth's most vicious biological warfare agents. These weren't your garden variety diseases. These were engineered nightmares created by a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of killing each other. Viruses that could rewrite DNA in real time, bacteria that consumed organic matter so aggressively they could reduce a human body to component molecules in minutes, and prions so twisted that they could corrupt the very concept of biological order. All ships maintain distance. O'Connor's voice came through the com channel with the kind of calm that came from accepting that you were about to die for something important. I'm carrying some very unfriendly passengers, and they're about to get a new home. He aimed his ship straight at the heart of the Devourer swarm. The cargo hold's containment systems already failing as the biological agents inside began to interact with each other in ways that would have given the galaxies top xenobiologists nightmares. You want to devour reality? O'Connor roared into his cum as his ship accelerated towards certain death. Digest our nightmares. The Last Stand impacted the largest Void Devourer and immediately began venting its cargo into the creature's impossible structure. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the biological agents began to work their magic. Here's the thing about evolution. It's not pretty, it's not elegant, and it definitely doesn't play fair. The viruses and bacteria in O'Connor's cargo hold had been designed by a species that understood survival at its most brutal level. They didn't just attack biological systems. They attacked the very concept of organized matter. The Void Devourers had adapted to consume energy, matter, even the fundamental forces of physics. But they'd never encountered weapons designed by a species that had turned biological warfare into an art form. The engineered diseases spread through the Devourer fleet like wildfire through dry grass, rewriting their alien biology faster than they could adapt. The creatures began to die, and their death cries tore holes in space-time itself. The sound, if it could be called sound, was like the universe itself screaming in agony. As things that shouldn't have been able to die began to fall apart at the molecular level, but even as the void, devourers writhed and dissolved in the vacuum of space, something else was stirring in the depths of the Centaurian system, something larger, hungrier, and far more intelligent than the creatures they'd just destroyed. The real enemy was about to reveal itself. The silence that followed the death of the void devourers wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a massive explosion. When your ears are still ringing and your brain is trying to process what just happened, 43 human ships drifted among what could only be described as the corpses of gods. Their hulls scarred by weapons fire and their crews struggling to comprehend that they'd actually won. Admiral Rebecca Stone stood on the bridge of the USS Liberty, staring out at the debris field that had once been humanity's first encounter with cosmic horror. Chunks of impossible geometry floated past the viewport, still flickering with energies that hurt to look at directly. Her reflection in the transperistal showed a woman who'd aged a decade in the past few hours, but whose eyes still burned. With the kind of fire that had carried humanity from cave paintings to starships, "Casualty reports," she ordered, her voice hoarse from shouting orders during the battle. Lieutenant Noah Martinez, his young face streaked with sweat and tears, looked up from his console. 17 ships report major damage, Admiral. We lost the Hell's Digger, the Last Stand, and..." His voice cracked, the Valiant. Captain Rodriguez went down with her ship when her reactor core breached. Stone closed her eyes for a moment, adding more names to the list of people who'd died on her orders. People who'd volunteered to fly into hell because someone had to answer that desperate call for help. The weight of command never got easier. Even after 4 decades of making decisions that turned living, breathing human beings into statistics and memories. But before she could process the grief, before she could begin to count the cost of what they'd accomplished, her tactical officer called out with barely controlled excitement, "Admiral, we've got incoming single ship, Centaurian configuration, approaching under a diplomatic flag. Want to know what's funny about moments like these?" Here they were, floating among the remains of creatures that could unmake reality itself, and everyone on the bridge still tensed up at the sight of a single alien vessel. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits involve decades of treating every non-human contact as a potential threat. But this wasn't a threat. This was something much more complicated. High Commander Keelix's ship was a work of art, a crystalline structure that seemed to bend light around itself, propelled by engines that manipulated space-time like a musician playing a harp. It was the kind of elegant, beautiful technology that civilized species created when they had millions of years to perfect the intersection of form and function. It was also completely useless against the kind of enemy they'd just faced. Permission to come aboard, Admiral Stone. Calix's transmission came through the CUM system, his voice carrying harmonics that the translation software still couldn't quite process. I would like to speak with you personally." 20 minutes later, the Centaurian commander materialized on the bridge via holographic projection. And the change in him was shocking. The being who'd once commanded fleets with casual authority had been the galactic community's answer to any military problem for 3 centuries. Looked like a survivor of some unimaginable trauma. His silver skin, usually flawless, was marked with stress fractures that looked like scars. His forearms trembled slightly, and those famous gem-like eyes now held an expression that any human would recognize. Instantly, the hollow look of someone who'd watched their entire world crumble and somehow lived to tell about it. "Your species," Kylix said slowly, his words carrying the weight of someone making a fundamental realization about the nature of the universe. "Fights like existence itself is your enemy." Admiral Stone allowed herself a weary smile, though her eyes remained haunted by the faces of the people who wouldn't be going home. "Commander, existence has been trying to kill us since we crawled out of the primordial ooze on a planet that treated every sunrise as a personal challenge. We learned long ago that sometimes, to save something beautiful, you have to become something ugly. She gestured toward the debris field visible through the bridge's main viewport, where the remains of cosmic horrors drifted among the wreckage of human ships. Your people spent millions of years creating elegant solutions to complex problems. You've built weapons that could fold space-time, manipulate dimensions, harness the power of black holes. Beautiful, sophisticated, civilized. Her smile turned sharp, predatory. We spent our entire evolutionary history surrounded by things that wanted to eat us, so we got very good at returning the favor. When your elegant solutions failed, you needed someone who understood that survival isn't about being nice. Captain Oliver Hayes, his uniform torn and blood-stained from the battle, stepped forward with the kind of righteous anger that came from watching good people die for a cause they believed in. The Galactic Council branded us Deathworlders like it was a curse, Commander. Now, you kept us contained in our little corner of space because you were afraid of what we might do if we ever turned our creativity toward conquest. His weathered face hardened into an expression that would have made enemy commanders surrender rather than face what came next. But when the real monsters came calling, when cosmic horror decided to start eating civilizations like popcorn, who did you turn to? Who answered that desperate call for help? Dr. Charlotte Wilson looked up from her scientific instruments, her hair disheveled and her lab coat stained with coffee and exhaustion. She'd spent the past few hours analyzing the remains of creatures that shouldn't have been able to die, trying to understand how Earth's biological weapons had succeeded where Centaurian technology had failed. They called us savages, barbarians, she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from understanding uncomfortable truths about the universe. But when the cosmos sent something that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be negotiated with, couldn't be civilized into submission, they needed someone who understood that sometimes the choice isn't between good and evil, it's between survival and extinction. Calyx was quiet for a long moment, his alien features struggling to process what he was hearing. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We always wondered why your species seemed so angry, so ready for violence. We thought it was a flaw in your evolution, a mistake that would eventually be corrected by exposure to civilized society. He looked around the bridge, taking in the faces of humans who'd just saved his entire civilization using methods that would give peacekeepers nightmares. We never understood that it wasn't a flaw. It was a feature. As the human fleet began its long journey home through the hyperspace lanes, they left behind a fundamentally changed galaxy. The Centaurians would rebuild their shattered worlds, but they would never again look at humanity with the same mixture of fear and disgust. Now that fear was tempered with something else, respect for a species that had proven that sometimes monsters were exactly what the universe needed. News of the battle spread through the galactic communication networks like wildfire, carried by traders, diplomats, and refugees who'd witnessed the impossible, a human fleet defeating enemies that had consumed entire star systems. The story grew in the telling, becoming legend, but the core truth remained unchanged. When cosmic horror had come knocking at civilization's door, the galaxy hadn't called for saints or philosophers or enlightened beings who'd transcended the need for violence. They'd called for sinners who knew how to fight dirty. The humans had answered that call with toxins that could rewrite biology in real time, diseases engineered to consume organized matter, and weapons so vile that they were banned on every civilized world. They'd saved the galaxy by embracing their inner darkness, proving once again that Earth's greatest export wasn't hope, wisdom, or any of the noble ideals that other species aspired to. It was controlled malice, wrapped in a flag and pointed at the right enemy, and in the darkness between the stars. Other ancient horrors felt a chill run through whatever passed for their spines as word spread of what the Deathworlders had accomplished. The galaxy had found its guardians, and they were exactly as terrifying as everyone had always feared. The end.